Ladies and gentlemen, this is Nate Crespo, your host for today and forever, and welcome back to another episode of the Lawyers in the Making podcast, where it is my job to focus on the unique journeys to the law and law school of professionals in the legal field and law students. Let's talk about what we're doing today, because today we have another spectacular guest. He's a University of Maine School of Law graduate and currently works as the owner of Falcon Forward Law Group. He's held past positions as a hearing attorney at Jackson and McGhee, and as a legal intern at Maine Equal Justice. Finally, he is the host of the 20 Years Done podcast. Excited to have him on the podcast today, Mr. Chris McGhee. Welcome to the podcast. How are we doing today? Before going any further, I'd like to say a quick word about the sponsor of this podcast, Rhetoric. Back in episode 25, I had the privilege of having the CEO, Luke Yingling, on the podcast, and ever since that episode, fell in love with the product. Rhetoric takes user briefs and motions and compares them against the text of opinions written by judges to identify ways to tailor their arguments to better persuade the judges handling their cases. Rhetoric's focus on persuasion and helps users find new ways to improve their odds of success through more persuasive arguments. Know more, win more. I was able to see a demo of the product, and its cutting-edge technology and fascinating features make for a product I am proud to sponsor, and further shows the new digital era the field of law has been entering thus far on my journey doing this podcast. If you decide to book a demo, let them know Nate sent you. Be sure to check them out in the show notes below or at userhetoric.com. One word, userhetoric.com. Now, back to the show.
I'm doing pretty good. How you doing, Nate?
I am doing just fantastic. It is a little rainy, it is a little cloudy, but it's totally okay. The sun will be out soon enough. I will see it soon enough. Now, Chris, before we get started, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Oh, if it's got to be a little bit, it's gonna be a problem. So, I grew up in like inner city St. Louis, where I was in a lot of poverty. And when I went to graduate high school, I was the first in my family to graduate high school. And I was so limited by my circumstances. I didn't think I could ever be an attorney. Like I wanted to be an attorney, but I didn't know about need-based scholarship or Pell Grants or anything like that. I just didn't think college was for people like me. And so I joined the United States Air Force, where I served in the Air Force for 20 years as an F-16 aircraft mechanic. And then towards the end of my career, I got my bachelor's degree in organizational leadership. And when I retired in 2018, I then applied to go to the University of Maine School of Law. I started in the fall of 2019. I was really looking forward to going to law school because my undergraduate degree was fully online. And I was really looking forward to being in a classroom, engaging with people, raising my hand, asking questions. And then 6 months into my law school tenure, COVID hit, and we went fully remote for the rest of my time in my Juris Doctorate.
Wow. That's crazy. I'm so sorry to hear that. First of all, you never got that ink. Well, you did come back to school eventually, but we'll all get to that. But let's start all the way back because I do my research. I love doing my research. In 2007, you started as a maintenance training instructor for the United States Air Force. Then you went on, you became an assistant section chief, then an expediter, then an aircraft section chief, then a production superintendent. You were the lead product superintendent, the product improvement manager, and finally, you ended as an F-16 mechanic. You did there 20 years. You were in Arizona. You were in New Mexico. You're in beautiful, beautiful places. I love myself some Arizona. But can you talk about all of that experience in the Air Force, your time in the Air Force? I mean, that's a very loaded question because there's a lot going on there. Correct. But I guess start at the beginning because I'm interested. As you said, you didn't really think college was an option. So why did you choose the Air Force?
Nate, I'm not going to come on here and I'm not going to lie. So I'm going to tell you the God's honest truth. So when you ask a question like that, I don't have a lie teed up. Originally, I was going to join the Army, but the Army's recruiters' teeth were terrible. And that's going to sound really superficial. And I'm certainly not saying all people in the Army have bad teeth, but to me, it was like, well, what's going on here? Like, what's the quality of their healthcare or their dental care if this is the face of the Army and like this is how it is? And so I ended up talking to an Air Force recruiter, and I joined open mechanical, which means I'm going to go into the maintenance area, but they don't know what job I'm going to happen to get, which is ironic because I took the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery Test, the ASVAB test. And my score for admin, so there's four categories: admin, general, electrical, mechanical. My score for admin, I believe, was a 98, and my score for mechanical was a 67. It was my lowest score. And my recruiters went, "Oh, you qualify to be open mechanical." I'm like, "Yeah, but wait a minute. Admin's a 98. Shouldn't you be slotting me into an admin job?" And they're like, "Yeah, but you qualify for open," because they have needs, right? So they slotted me in. And I was not mechanically inclined growing up. Like, I'm really clumsy with my hands. I'm also a pretty big dude. I got big hands, so getting into tight spaces is tough. Um, and like a good example is when I got a flat tire on my bike growing up. If it was the front tire, I would take off the rim and I would figure out how to change the tire. If it was the back tire, I couldn't figure out how to get the chain out of the gears. So like if the back tire goes flat, well, I guess my bike's done. I can't do anything about it. I was just not mechanically inclined. And so when I joined the Air Force, I went into a career field that was obviously very mechanical, very hands-on, very difficult, very strenuous, very stressful. And it was sink or swim. And I probably sunk, but I faked like I was swimming, if that makes sense. Until eventually I moved into a point into my experience in my career where what I learned was anybody can turn wrenches and fix jets and remove components and do these things, but it takes someone that has a certain gift to be able to troubleshoot and to look for root cause analysis, like really understand the symptoms, understand how this system works, which doesn't require putting hands on. You're just observing symptoms. You're figuring out, you're reading schematics, you're reading theory of operation, you're putting it through the wheels in your brain to solve the problem, and then you start applying the fix. And in my experience, being the person that could troubleshoot effectively, which means you figure it out quickly, you figure out the true reason, and you fix it efficiently, that is worth, thousands of man hours of people that can simply remove and replace an actuator or some landing gear or things like that. And so that's where I really came into an area that I was very comfortable with. And eventually I did apply to be a maintenance training instructor. And ironically, it was because I had a fear of public speaking and I wanted to do something that would challenge me. And so obviously now I don't have a fear of public speaking. I host a podcast. I'm an attorney. Public speaking is not an issue for me anymore. So, and then after being a maintenance training instructor, I just moved into more and more supervisory roles, culminating as a lead production superintendent, where my job was essentially to forecast long-range maintenance efforts for a fleet of F-16s valued at like $1.5 billion, I think it was.
No, that's absolutely amazing and absolutely awesome that you're working on F-16s of all things. I mean, I've never seen one in real life. I have seen them fly over. I've never been up close and, personal with the F-16, but they're very, very cool. They're very futuristic. It's something like people in the 70s think about, Back to the Future, which probably didn't come out in the 70s, but that's what they imagined was
Right.
going on. So you were working on some things that were cutting edge technology. And to go to sort of that troubleshooting part of it, I thought it was wonderfully said. It reminded me one of my favorite shows. I love House. I love watching House.
Yep.
So one of the huge things that they do is break down the symptoms, find the root causes. What is causing all these symptoms? Or is one of the symptoms the root cause? And they go from there, find those diseases and such. So sort of, it's very intellectually curious sort of domain
Correct.
of thinking and framework. And do you know at any point when you decided that this is something that you wanted to do, this is something you wanted to get good at in terms of troubleshooting, like where did that intellectual curiosity come from? Was there something in your past you can point to where you're like, this is something I'd want to do?
So, I mean, with the Air Force, you do a contract. I did a 6-year contract. I made staff sergeant at my 3.5-year mark, which was really early. And that isn't to brag. It was likely because I'm a smart person, but it was also because the Air Force had a really big need for staff sergeants. And you might think in the military they're only promoting the best. I have bad news for you. What they do is they go, we need 15,000 staff sergeants. We all take a test. And if we're all incompetent, it doesn't matter because they're still going to promote the top 15,000 people of those incompetent people. So I'm not saying we're all incompetent. I'm not saying I was incompetent, but when I say I made it 3.5 years, that had a lot more to do with systemic issues within the military promotion system than my fitness to be a non-commissioned officer at that time. But essentially, before my first contract was up, I was thrust into a supervisory position, and I remember in the early part of my career, I was like the junior ranking staff sergeant, so my responsibility was low. And then there was just an exodus of people moving to different bases and things. And one night I was at work, and my boss, Brian Ingram, was telling me all the things that were broke. We got an engine removal on this. We need to do a landing gear ops check on this. We need to tow this one to the fuel barn, and we need to do a flight control rigging on this one. And I said, Brian, why are you telling me all this stuff? He's like, you're the only staff sergeant on shift tonight. And that's when it was like, oh no. Because I knew I didn't know enough to manage all of that workload. And I did a podcast with Brian recently, and it turns out he knew I didn't have enough to manage that workload too. But what he did was he supported me where he could. He didn't give me answers. He gave me time to fail. Failing is a part of troubleshooting. It's learning what works and what doesn't work. Allows you to think through. You need to have like that room to move around intellectually and kind of explore. And then maybe at the very end they go, okay, you've played enough. Let's solve this. Let's figure this out. But towards the end of that sixth year, I was working really hard. The hours were crazy, but I was relied upon by my unit and by senior leadership. I was the go-to guy. And man, that's a really good feeling. And then the final point I'll make is there is an endorphin hit when you have been struggling to fix a jet for days or weeks, and you have your team, and we've been working 12 to 15 hours a night, 5 or 6 days a week, and you finally like just grit through and you solve the problem, and that jet flies, and you have fixed it. It's a good quality fix. That endorphin hit, it's so instant, because a lot of jobs, you're doing something just to make some arbitrary numbers on some spreadsheet go up, or you never see the client, you never see the results of your efforts. But fixing jets is hard work, but man, the gratification from getting it done, it's a big rush.
Yeah, the something so tangible like a jet, so huge like a jet, which you can actually viscerally feel, and you can visually feel your fix being made and it actually working. Like, oh my God, like all those hours I just put in actually were just satisfied
Yep.
because look, the jet is flying, it's moving perfectly, it's doing what it needs to do. Now, getting thrown into the fire, like you were being the only staff sergeant there that one night and then continuing on to be the only one there. How was that being thrown to the fire like that? And on top of that, I know you said it's very important to fail. It's very important to fail forward, especially to learn from your mistakes. So how important was being thrown into the fire? Just generally for people out there listening, how important it is to do that to yourself so you can, move forward, grow.
I mean, in hindsight, it was huge. I didn't know that my boss knew that I was in over my head. Like he was very patient, very gracious, and he really protected me from micromanagement above him. And that is so important. He didn't just get in and solve it for me and then just hand me, hey, go change this part. This is what it is. He was developing me. Like there is a very important part of investing in your people in the near term, because it's going to pay dividends in the long term. And he knew that, and he took a lot of flack for the time it took me to get spun up, because I was still clumsy and I wasn't where I was supposed to be. But I told him on the podcast, I view all of the things I've done, that moment in time was an inflection point for me. It was a time where I shifted tracks in my mindset in my life. And I told Brian this, and he got, humbled and embarrassed at the same time. Like, it set me on the path where I am today, which is we're going to solve problems. We're going to attack root causes. We're going to be tenacious. We are going to know things inside and out. We are going to be experts. It's what we do. And I did my best to essentially pay that forward when I was in a similar position, to allow people to grow and fail. Sometimes I succeeded, sometimes I didn't. But that was, to me, an absolute turning point in my professional life, for sure, that it continues to this day.
So this inflection point, this turning point, I gotta ask, what ways did your mindset change? What did it entail, this mindset change that you had within you during this very, reflective time in your life?
You know what it was? It was the first earned victory in something. In particular, what it was On the F-16, I'll try not to get too technical. On the F-16, we have a separate engine that starts the engine. It's a small engine, and it's a very sort of delicate thing between hydraulics, pneumatics, fuel, spark, air. There's a bunch of things going on, which means the more complicated it is, the more places, pinch points it can fail. And we had just a whole bunch of no starts, and there was no one else to work on it. And I had to start trial and error, suffering. I mean, when I said we had to have 3 or 4 jets no starting, which required me to spend 4 or 5 hours per jet, and I'm just sliding around, and it's deep work, and it's difficult, and it's what's really frustrating is you have to take it completely apart to change the thing you think it is, and then you put it completely back together, and then you run it, and if you run it after you put it all back together, it takes 30 minutes to 2 hours. It might have been wrong, and now it's too hot to take apart again, so you have to wait. Right? It's a very frustrating, it's a very high stakes sort of thing where you need to be precise. And then what it was we had one jet, I think it was aircraft 88 434, if I remember correctly, that I was struggling on a fix for so long, and then I finally called the fuel control bad, and I replaced it, and it had a start where it was just, you knew it was starting. You could hear, like, you ever hear a car that's running rough and you hear a car that's running well? Like, that's how, like, I could hear that it was running well, it was doing what it was supposed to do. And that was that first victory. And then I became an absolute expert on the start system. And then I started developing my landing gear. I started developing my flight controls, my engine things. And I started developing all these expertises. And really, like, that inflection point was getting that first victory where it wasn't handed to me. Nobody told me to change the fuel control. That was me figuring it out, where I literally was following a schematic, trying to observe the behavior. Where is this failing in the sequence? Let me know the theory of operation. There's something fuel going on here. What else could it be? In making that decision. And that was one of the more difficult parts to change compared to the other fuel system components. So I had to take a risk and do the difficult parts. I thought it was the good fix, and that was the victory. And that's that endorphin rush too. It's this confidence. It's probably a little bit of ego and swagger, because eventually you become the guy that can fix things. But then it was, once that light bulb moment happened, I was no longer sinking and faking like I was swimming. I was then swimming at that point.
Yeah, it's such a powerful statement you're making there, like getting that real victory, that real tangible victory, finally realizing within yourself, outside of yourself, realizing, okay, like I could actually do this stuff.
Yep.
Like something is actually possible, like something in your head that was just merely a dream and you made it into a reality. It's like, okay, if I could do this, what else can I possibly do? And that definitely comes with the mindset change. So that growth mindset,
Yep.
being able to view the world as very resourceful, as okay, like here's a problem here, I can have a solution to it because I've made solutions all over the place. But moving forward in your career, you then went to Columbia Southern University, got a bachelor's degree in organizations. Would that be what it's
Or
considered to be?
organizational leadership. It's a bit of business management. It's a bit of psychology, team dynamics, really kind of understanding how individuals combine into a group to get things done, and the interplay between all of that to make it work.
So why did you decide to go off to the University of Columbia Southern?
Man, Nate, you keep asking these questions that are going to get those honest answers. So the answer is because all of my credits that I earned through the Community College of the Air Force, through my technical training, all of it would transfer for the degree. So it'd be the least amount. And also I picked that degree because I had the lowest math requirement. But what I'll say is, so that was my criteria, right? But what I'll say is, I was probably a little bit full of myself, and I thought a bachelor's degree doesn't matter. I'm just getting it to check a box. I'm getting it for what's next. But as I reflect on the last 10 years, where I've kind of thought about organizational culture and things like that, it's hard to argue that my education in organizational leadership is not the foundation for me to be able to observe systemic issues within organizations and be able to identify root causes and fixes and other things. So at the time, I didn't think my degree mattered. Now in hindsight, I think not only my degree matters, I think I got really lucky getting the degree I got, because I think it fits me perfectly.
So in continuing on, you just simply went there to check off a box, but as time went on, you decided that following year in 2019 to enter into the University of Maine School of Law. Now, usually in the episodes, we start with this question, but now we're a couple minutes in and now we're
Right.
sitting here. So, simply put, Chris, why did you go to law school?
Oh man. So I'll dip my toe briefly because we do have a set amount of time. Um, at the tail end of my career, I was actually a whistleblower. And through a legal process, I made a protected communication to a court proceeding that I later faced retaliation. Um, and I had to make myself legally thorny so that way, if the retaliation persisted, um, it was just going to be a very difficult process for those that were essentially employing their retaliation under color of authority. Um, and I had my bachelor's degree, and I always wanted to be an attorney, and I was already operating in a quasi legal space anyway. And ironically, as I was sticking up for myself and another service member in a administrative matter, but not a legal matter, a senior officer over me like interrupted me as I was explaining what we were doing. And he said, Chris, you know you're not a lawyer, right? And I said, no, I know. He's like, because it sounds like you think you're a lawyer. I'm like, well, this is a administrative proceeding. It has like he has a lawyer. The lawyer says he doesn't work in this space. It is essentially the gentleman was removed from a professional military education, and I had experience with the appeal process, and the lawyer that's outside the lawyer's purview, so I was helping him. And he said, you know, because I'm beginning to think that you think you're a lawyer. I'm like, I know I'm not a lawyer, but I'm operating in a space that a lawyer is not operating in. But it's a bit ironic that then I retired a year later, and I was like, well, all right, well, I'll just become a lawyer then.
Well, that's a great story, first of all. It's great lore.
Correct.
It gives you that depth to the rest of your career. But we always love talking about the first year of law school. Some people hate it, some people love it. How did you feel about it, Chris?
So what I'll begin with is I was obviously a non-traditional student, right? And what I'll say is, and we'll get into this later when we talk about my advocacy work that's outside of my law firm, is the military is a hyper restrictive organization and you know micro society, and you have Fourth Amendment right curtailment, you have First Amendment right curtailment, workplace protections are internal, not external. The Ferris Doctrine prevents suits for negligence or other torts. OSHA, the executive order specifically says OSHA doesn't apply to the military. The military has their own internal OSHA, but again, you're missing these external sources. You can't sue the military for civil rights violations. So like Article 3 courts are really not available too. And so I was going from a hyper restrictive existence to the pendulum wildly swung after my retirement. Because when I retire, first of all, the Fourth Amendment, First Amendment, those sorts of limitations are now evaporated. But also, I'm going to school using the Montgomery GI Bill or the Post 9/11 GI Bill, which means my tuition is paid for and I'm getting a tax-free housing stipend, right? I have my pension from my retirement. I have health insurance for me and my whole family from my retirement. I have a home loan through the VA, so it was zero money down. I have my VA disability rating, which is tax-free on top of my pension. So when I went to law school, you know, I really kind of threw my academic advisor for a loop in my 2L year, I think. He said, Chris, you know, what are you looking to do after law school? And I said, well, professor, by my math, I need to make about $15,000 a year. So if nothing works out, I'll work at Taco Bell. And he just looked at me like he didn't know what to do with me. But okay, so here's the truth. That first year of law school, it was hard. It was real hard. And I even after being alive for 20 years and all of my lived experience, I had imposter syndrome just the same as everybody else did. I don't think it's possible not to have imposter syndrome. I really don't. And that's because law school is such a foreign experience. And it's also you're a bit of a thrown in the deep end and everyone's sinking and faking like they're swimming. It's 2004 for me all over again. But what I found was I didn't need to be top of my class. I didn't need to get a big law job making $230,000 a year because I was going to have $300,000 worth of student loans that I was going to have to pay for. I was going to have no debt leaving law school, which means I just need to get good and the grades kind of don't matter, which is very liberating because then you can actually sit in class and learn. You don't have to chase outlines. You don't have to chase supplemental things. You don't have to do all these things. You can sit and learn and enjoy the learning process and ask questions without being afraid that the professor's going to know you didn't do the reading or you look dumb. Because I was looking for a B in a school that curved at like a B. Even when we would do like teaching fellows, like for all the 1L classes, all the doctrinals, we had like a teaching fellow that would go through the week's material and then do hypos. And then they would give model essay answers for the hypos for whatever the subject was that week. And it would be paragraphs. And it would address it would be IRAC format, and then it would address the thing. And then it would have paragraphs saying it's not this legal theory, it's not this. If this fact were applied, then you would do this. So it would be 7, 8, 9 paragraphs for an answer and be like, okay, this is a model answer. Who got close to this? And I'm like, definitely not me. And I'd raise my hand. I said, okay, so this answer is an A, right? They're like, yeah. I'm like, can you show me a B answer? Like, what's the 1 paragraph, 2 paragraph answer here? Because I'm not trying to get an A. Because the truth be told, the difference between the top 1% of your law school and median is it feels like 20 to 30 hours of studying per week is the difference between those two things. And for me, I wasn't lazy. I just had a family and I had a career and I had all these things where I didn't have to do that much work to get top of the class. And also there was young people. I don't want to take away when you're great on a curve. I don't want to do all these things, but I'll tell you what, people in my class, they probably would have never guessed where I was on the curve or the median because I was always viewed as somebody that was smart and quick and understood the law. They would never believe that I was median or just sub-median as my law school career went on. But that also goes to show that grades and knowledge are not always synonymous. And that's important to essentially offset that imposter syndrome. You don't want to place all of your value on your grades, especially when it's curved. Because if you have I think my class was like 92. If you have 92 Steve Jobs in one room, if you have 92 like absolute geniuses in a room, you're going to get a C. It's curved. And that doesn't mean you're dumb. You just happen to be paired up with 92 brilliant people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with all that, especially with the grades, as it is just a letter or a number that exists in some grade book that is pretty arbitrary and doesn't really define who you are, what kind of person you are, because you may be taking a class where you're really not interested in at all, and you may not do anything with it for the rest of your legal career.
Correct.
But some people put so much pressure on themselves to learn all these things that they probably don't want to learn and they're probably not interested in, just to forget it the week after they take the exam. So I
Yep.
think that's such an important sentiment to put out there, not to put so much pressure on yourself, to put so much value in all the grades, because at the end of the day, it doesn't define you. And like you said, you could be just in the classroom with people who are absolutely brilliant and who will go on to do so and so such thing, but you are also capable of doing those things. And there is so much value just outside of your grades in terms
Correct.
of, the things you do outside of it, either that be, organizing, being a part of clubs, being a part of organizations, throwing events, whatever it may be, there's a lot more value you can offer just beyond your grades. But what I'm interested in is having this 20-year background in the Air Force and going through law school. Was there anything that was a part of your Air Force experience that sort of overlapped within your law school experience, either that be through the work, the frameworks that you have, the troubleshooting that you do? Were there any overlap between that stuff?
Oh, for sure. So there's a few overlaps. So first of all, I was the student veteran liaison through the admissions office. So my job was to any potential veterans incoming to the college, I was just to meet with them and kind of talk to them about what the school offers, the veteran stuff, main sorts of veteran benefits and things like that, that maybe the housing stipend for the local area, just they would know, or how that compares to the market. I would always go to the JAG recruiting, like every school, like every semester, they have like a JAG recruiter from each of the branches is going to come in and give you free pizza and then only talk about the good of the military. Tell you what, I went in there, I ate all that pizza, and then when they got all done, they said, "Do you have any questions?" I'm not trying to drag, but I also wanted to lay out, okay, yeah, you do get 30 days of vacation a year, you do get all these things, but let's talk about what the burden is. Like, let's talk about this. And I would lay out some military policies and situations that are uncomfortable for a recruiter to address, because the answer is there's not a way to answer those questions without kind of revealing a little bit of the uncomfortable part of military service. Specifically, I was calling out the Office of General Counsel of the White House's memo saying waterboarding is not torture. Like, that's a hard thing to discuss. But also, as soon as that letter exists, that means it's a lawful order for an attorney to be supervising waterboarding. And you can't quit because it's a lawful order. And that's an uncomfortable scenario. Because when you're working downtown at a big firm and Big Tobacco comes in and says, "Hey, we gave a bunch of kids cancer and we want you to defend us," you can go, that's not my jam today. And your boss goes, "Well, you need to do it." Okay, why quit? That's an option. It may not be a good financial decision, but it's an option. But in the military, they go, "Hey, we want you to supervise this waterboarding to make sure that here's this memo saying it's not torture." You're like, "Wait a minute, I'm not comfortable supervising waterboarding." "Well, you need to go." "Well, I'm not feeling that. I quit." You can't. Oh, that's different. So I want to make sure that I balance the free pizza and the 30 days vacation a year with, you might be supervising waterboarding. Heads up. And you can't say no.
I mean, if there's one fact and one universal truth of the world, the one thing that a legal recruiter does not want to see is Chris McGhee walking into the room, because
I'll tell you what, this Navy recruiter, he got all done. He's like, "Hey, Chris, you're really sharp. Have you thought about rejoining the Navy as a JAG officer?" I was like, "Do you realize I would have to forego my pension, forego my disability?" I said, "You are brave. You are very brave to try to pitch me. Like, you're out of your mind. Thanks for the pizza."
Oh, that's so good, honestly. It's absolutely incredible stuff, Chris.
But
Really.
also concurrent with this is when I began my advocacy work. So I started a blog called 20 Years Done in 2018, where initially it was just me writing about good leaders and bad leaders in service. I didn't know what I was doing at the time, and I didn't think anybody would read it either. But I was writing about a story about when a really good leader did something that was amazing and it mattered to me, and I wanted to emulate that. And then I would maybe write a story about a really bad leader that did something that was toxic and abusive and terrible. And what I was doing was I was kind of creating like the boundaries for what a good leader is through all these qualities of this. If you go this way, it's bad. This way, it's good. And then eventually it shifted into, I wrote the story of my whistleblower event, and I had lots of evidence and court documents and things, essentially explaining that story, because in the military I couldn't disclose it because for fear of further retaliation. But then I started moving into an analysis of current military decisions, policies, regulations, and things. One of which was in October 2018, the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, essentially wrote a directive to the services saying he wanted certain fighter aircraft to meet a certain readiness rate. And I had obviously just come out of that world, and I knew what those aircraft were capable of based on the people, the experience, the parts, and the time. And there was already a lot of suicides that were happening, and I was worried that this new mandate was essentially going to break a bunch of people's psychologically and drive suicides up. And I wrote in I think October 2018, I said, this is going to drive a lot of suicides. And then 3 months later, I found out a guy that worked for me committed suicide. And a week later, a friend of his committed suicide. And then a week later, someone else committed suicide in another unit. And it was boom, boom, boom. And I thought it was an issue with that base and that unit. So what I did was in July of 2019, right before I started law school, this was 2 months before I started law school, I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Headquarters Air Force asking for suicide rates for the last 10 years by occupation code. I wanted to know if there was a correlation between certain occupations and certain suicide rates. And anytime I tell people that's what I was doing, they're like, "Well, yeah, of course. Like, of course your job is going to affect suicide rates, right?" Because I wanted to, let's first frame the problem. If I have the same Americans entering the military and then splitting out and going into these career fields, and then I see disparate rates of suicide from one career field to another, I've eliminated a lot of the demographic sort of play, and we're almost all in the same age range. and we're almost all the same demographics anyway. So that's essentially a wash. Now I just have a disparity based on this particular metric. That should drive an inquiry of what's going on here in this year, what policies, suicide is going to be a lagging indicator of something. So what policies, what manpower, what things were preceding this suicide spike in this year, or maybe it went up and then stayed level. In August of 2019, the Air Force publicly announced that they were on pace to have more suicides that year than any other year they had ever had. So like the important thing there is I was asking for suicide numbers before the Air Force announced they had more suicides. So that told me I was onto something.
Now, keep going if you want.
So what I'll say, at least just to carry me through my law school career, because I'll bounce back and forth between the advocacy and law school, and you'll understand why, is in January of 2020. So I've been in law school for 6 months now. And so I sent the Freedom of Information Act request, FOIA, for Here Forward. And that just takes time, right? So it went into that black hole and I waited and I could concentrate on doing the law school stuff. And then in January of 2020, they came back and said, oh, we don't track suicides by military occupation. And so I called up public affairs at the Pentagon and I said, hey, I'm writing a story for my blog that you guys don't track suicides by occupation. Now, I'm not sure which way to go on the blog. Are you guys liars or are you incompetent? Which angle for the blog article do I write? Or is there a third option I'm not seeing why you wouldn't have information on suicides by occupation? So there's a long, uncomfortable silence. And it was later confirmed on the record. They said, oh, yeah, we do have those numbers. So they gave me a denial saying they didn't have the records. So that was the very first organizational dishonesty that the Air Force showed me. They said, we don't have those records. And when I said, well, I'm going to call you liars or incompetent. Oh, wait a minute, we do. And they said, but we're not the release authority, DOD is. So we're going to submit a new FOIA for you up to DOD on your behalf. So what should have happened is when it got to Air Force, they should have went, we're not the release authority, and they should have referred my FOIA up to DOD, and I would have maintained my place in line with the July 19th start date. Instead, they gave me a no records request, not expecting me to twist the knife, and then they resubmitted. So I was put at the back of the FOIA line in January of 2020. So then what I started doing in law school, so then I get through my 1L year, right? And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to do criminal defense. And so I took criminal procedure in my fall of 2L. And I got maybe 5 cases in, and I went, we as a country have completely screwed this up. And I'm going to be angry all the time. If I have to be a defense attorney and I have to operate within the confines of how we've defined Fourth Amendment rights and Fifth Amendment and things like this, I'm going to be really angry all the time. And I was angry in my 20 years in the Air Force. I'm not going to choose to enter a career and be angry. So I'm like, I'm not doing that. So I flipped it to a pass fail because we were in COVID. So the grades were they were more flexible because of that. I flipped to a pass fail and I was like, I'm just going to do enough to get by. I could feel my anger rising as I would read cases, and it was just super frustrating. But it was also the first time I discovered Thurgood Marshall. Well, actually, I think I discovered him in con law. It was the first time I read, usually I was reading his dissents because I'd read the majority opinion and go, these guys, they don't understand what it's like for poor people and minorities. Like, they don't get it. And then I'd read this dissent. I'd be like, oh my God, this guy, he understands. And then, okay, that makes sense. Thurgood Marshall, that makes sense. And then in the spring of my 2L, I took international human rights, and I cried my first class. And I was like, well, I guess that's not an area. That feels like that's a litmus test. If you cry reading the cases, you probably can't practice that type of law. That's a real safe bet. And then around that same time as I got the response back from DOD, DHA saying they were going to withhold the suicide numbers by occupation, citing a B6 privacy exemption under the Freedom of Information Act. And so that didn't make sense to me because I'm asking for occupation code and whether there was a suicide and what year. That is not invasion of privacy at all whatsoever. So I took admin law because I was getting ready to file administrative appeals and start to do all these things. And so I talked to my admin professor and we kind of brainstormed. I submitted the appeal, and then I realized I was going to get ready to start suing the Department of Defense as a law student. I was like, I'm just going to pro se, go in and sue them. Like I've already looked at the law, I learned in admin law, like what the threshold is. I'm just going to start suing. So I took pretrial practice so I could learn how to file complaints and motions. My law school was two things. My JD was two things. It was figuring out which area laws I knew I couldn't practice because I would hate myself or be angry all the time. And then the other one was learning the law so that way I could hold the government accountable through my advocacy work. That was the entirety of my law school career.
Well, I think that's so beautiful that that was the entirety of your law school career, because that is such a significant topic we always love talking about on this podcast, is finding out what you want to do with the law, which is, not hard, but it can be difficult sometimes, but it's much easier if you find out what you don't want to do.
Correct.
So, if you're going to the international law class and you're crying at the cases, that's probably something you don't want to pursue. Now, moving forward, you did graduate from law school. You had some internships. You worked as an intern at Jackson and McNicol, and then as an intern at Maine Equal Justice. And then eventually, the following year, you came back to law school. You got your master's of law. Now, I don't think I've ever had someone who has immediately went back and got their LLM. So can you discuss why you decided to do that?
You're asking another one of those questions I can't lie about, Nate. So I graduated with my JD and I started studying for the bar in June of 2022. June 1st, I started. So, it's 6-7 weeks of study. And man, bar prep is just miserable. And I took the bar. So the first day was MPT, the multi-state practical, where you don't need to know any law. They give you a packet. It's like coming from a partner. Here's the client. Here's the case law. Here's the statutory law. These are the questions we need to answer. Go. Which I felt like I was very well equipped for because I did so little reading in law school and I was shoot from the hip most of the classes anyway. I was like, this is my jam. Don't do the reading and just show up on the spot and try to figure out the answer. I've been practicing my whole life for this. And then I went to lunch and I texted my partner. I said, hey, I think I just murdered the MPT. I was like, it felt like I got a 90 to 95% on it. Unfortunately, Maine doesn't break down the category scores. I don't know. And then I came back for the afternoon and I did the MEE and just obliterated. And I went home and I was like, well, I focused a lot on the MBE, on the multiple choice. And that was the second day, morning and afternoon. That's what I really drilled for the last 6 weeks. So, I hope it'll carry me. And when I did the bar prep, I did barbering. I thought barbering was great, but they said one of the lectures they gave, they said, we're giving you like 6 to 10 difficulty questions. The bar exam, you're going to be looking at 3 to 10 difficulty. So we're giving you a higher concentration of more difficult questions. So when you go in to take that test, you're going to be better prepared. I'll tell you what, those multiple choice questions, at least for, summer of 2022, they all felt like 8 to 10s easily. Like I could see a question writer. I literally role played this on my lunch where he walked over the cubicle of another question writer and be like, Dave, you're not going to believe the fact pattern I created today. No one's going to get this. And there was like some like jerk competition to see who could write the more convoluted, difficult question. And they were just like one-upping each other. And then that became my test. Right. And I didn't think I passed. And my partner's like, Chris, I'm sure you passed, And I said, the pass rate, I think for the February, I think was like 60 or 70%. And I think in the last summer, it was maybe 80% or something. So there was there was a significant chance that I was going to be in that 20 to 40%. And so I did like a post-bar exam vacation down in Puerto Rico and just sat on the beach. But that little demon was always in the back of my head. It wasn't like conscious, but it was just that primordial feeling. And I was like, I don't think I passed. So what I did was I still had my VA education benefits and I get a housing stipend. And I basically went, well, I'm just going to go back and get an LLM because I can still get my monthly stipend. And when I inevitably fail the bar exam, I'll just graduate the next spring. Nobody will know. and then I'll just take it again, and it'll just look like I never failed, was my plan. And then I passed. Clearly mistakes were made. I couldn't believe I passed. And then, so now I'm in law school as a barred and licensed attorney, which makes you like straight rock star status to all the law students because you have passed through this crucible. You have all the answers to how to pass the bar when it just feels like they spin a wheel and whatever score it lands on is the score you get. But I had already done a semester. I was like, well, I'll finish it out, I guess.
Well, that is first another one of those amazing stories, I have to say, of actually just going back to law school because you're like, oh my God, I might fail. And then you pass, and now you're a licensed attorney, which is usually a rarity in law school. So you are certainly one of a kind in your law school environment in terms of being that licensed attorney. Let's go to what you're doing today as the owner of Falcon Forward Law Group. So, what is Falcon Forward Law Group, and what are you doing there?
So I did an intern at Jackson McNichol in my 1L to 2L summer. And that was also right when COVID hit. So it was sitting inside doing essentially medical records document review. That was a VA disability firm. I had actually tried to hire them before I went to law school for my VA disability claim, and they looked at my case and went, "Nah, no, thank you." So I did it on my own, and I won what I was looking for. So when I interviewed with them for an internship, I was like, "Oh, I was going to hire you guys, but you guys turned me down." They're like, "Oh, I'm sorry." I'm like, "Well, don't be sorry because I did it on my own. I'd have to pay you a 20% contingency fee." So it actually worked out for me. Thanks. So I basically learned how to like essentially build a case, how to service connect things, how to look at secondary, how to look at aggravation, how to look at presumptions, and sort of do all these things. And then I ended up after I was barred, that's when I applied to work at Jackson McNichols as a hearing attorney, and I worked there only 4 months. But between my internship and that, I basically had a really good understanding of the law, and then also at the same time, I was doing a whole lot of work in my advocacy space. I was doing work locally as well for some Maine veteran issues where I was kind of pushing back against some state policies. So I knew that I had essentially a lot of positive media coming my way, positive publicity coming my way. And it might sound kind of selfish. I didn't want my brand that I had built, and I didn't build the brand to be an attorney. I built the brand because I was a tenacious advocate, and that's just the way it was. But I didn't want that to create a client stream for a company that wasn't mine when I had done all of this work. And so again, it goes back to the privilege. Like I have so much privilege. And so I quit working at Jackson McNichol. I gave 30 days notice, and I stopped working there in December. And then I started building my website, and I got my malpractice insurance, and I got my case management software, and I got my, all the things I need to set up a firm. But because of the area of law that I work in, it's all video hearings. It's remote. So I don't have overhead of an office. I don't have overhead of a staff. I still have my health insurance through the military for myself and my dependents. So it's almost no out-of-pocket costs. I have my pension. I have my disability compensation. So essentially, I could start a law practice with essentially no risk, and I could capitalize on my podcast, on my blog, and all my advocacy work to essentially create noise for a client stream. So I launched the Falcon Forward Law Group on January 1st of this year. My goal was to pick up 2 clients a month. So what's really unfortunate about VA disability law is the way most of the fee models are for us is you get a contingency fee based on the back pay the client gets for an appealed claim. So it needs to be appealed, and then it needs to have adjudication based on the appeal, and then you get a percentage of the back pay. So sometimes the appeals can take 9 months, and sometimes the appeals can take 6 years. So I am almost 10 months into this year. I have not been paid yet, right? So that's that investment in myself, right? I've had a lot of good positive outcomes for my clients, but the way it's been, they weren't in appeals. I was helping them with initial claims as part of like how to build a client base. And so I've had a lot of clients have very successful claims, reaching 100% disability ratings and other things. But unfortunately, that doesn't solicit any sort of payment to me. But it's the long term, right? So I'm investing in myself in the near term. And I'll tell you what, I encourage anyone that's an attorney that can financially afford it to be your own boss, because the freedom that has given me, Sunday nights come around. When I first started my law firm, for like the first month or two, I would get that Sunday night anxiety of the work week, and it would pop up. And then 3 minutes later, my brain would catch up and go, Chris, you run your own firm now. You're your own boss. Like, you don't answer to anyone besides your clients, and you just get to work on their behalf. And then that melts away. And now Sunday comes and goes, and it doesn't even register. I did an informal conference in Africa 3 weeks ago. Not intentionally. That's just the way it lined up. But it just goes to show that it's a very portable sort of practice area. I can practice it almost anywhere. And the freedom it has given me. Now, I will say the freedom also includes the fact I haven't been paid. So like those kind of run hand in hand, at least for the beginning. But the work-life balance, I think, is absolutely fantastic, which it does allow me to do a lot of my advocacy work. It frees me up to do advocacy work during the workday, and that I wouldn't have had time to do otherwise, which in turn creates like a client stream. So I'm 10 months in, and I think I'm at 22 clients. So I'm pretty much on pace for what I wanted, 2 clients per month.
Well, first of all, congratulations, as it is quite an honorable and amazing accomplishment. And what I love so much about it all is it fully encapsulates that message of the importance of having that long-term vision, staying with that long-term vision, being consistent with it, and also talking about that freedom that you have of being your own boss. You don't have to get those Sunday scaries. As if they do come around, you get that Sunday anxiety. It's like, oh, I could just work on it right now if you really wanted to. Or you can have a nice Sunday, go on with your life, start on Monday, ready to go. But hey, maybe you don't want to work on Tuesday. You don't have to work on Tuesday.
Correct.
It's the beauty of having that freedom of being your own boss. And I absolutely 100% love what you're saying and agree with what you're saying. But I want to close the book on this story here with the Department of Defense. Now, you sent me an article encapsulating the whole story itself, which will be in the description below if anyone is interested. But you were looking for that suicide data, and you were getting incomplete data. You were getting data that didn't exist. So what has transpired so far, and what does the present of the situation look like right now?
So what I'll say is I'm very blessed to be in Maine, because if I was in California, I probably wouldn't be telling the story I'm about to tell you, because in Maine, we are, I think, population like 1.1 million total for the whole state. So it just feels like there's more access to our elected representatives. Whereas if I was in California, I'm trying to reach out to a senator to ask a question. Population of California is like, what, 50 million, 100 million? I don't know. It's a bunch, right? Like you'd have to have way more juice in order to even get spoken to. So I had just come off. So I essentially, DOD, Department of Defense Health Agency had told me, we're not going to give you the suicide data because it works in invasion of privacy. I had filed an administrative appeal to that decision and went into the administrative appeal back hole. Ironically, that appeal is still pending. And so I was essentially gearing up to sue. That was my plan. Actually, I talked to my law school. I said, hey, can I sue the DOD and get credit for it? They're like, yeah, sure. That sounds like a great idea. I was trying to get an experiential to get a privacy certificate attached to my LLM. They're like, I'm suing the Department of Defense against a privacy exemption. It's privacy law. I feel like this counts. They're like, yeah, let's do it. Great. So in January of 2022, because I had worked in the veteran space prior to going law school. When I came to Maine, I got a job working in the veteran space. A staffer that worked for Senator Angus King, the Maine senator, is on the Senate Armed Services Committee, reached out to me and said, hey, Senator King is interviewing Maine veterans about their time in the military. Would you like to come on? As for a Library of Congress project. It'll be entered in the Library of Congress. You want to do it? I was like, sure. They said, I see you have a podcast. You probably have a lot to talk about. And I was like, this is true. I'm a very opinionated person. So when I went on this interview, so I've given you a very brief synopsis of my Freedom of Information Act request. I actually had a lot more FOIA requests. I was asking for fleet health numbers to show the degradation of the quality of the fleet prior to sequestration, where we cut 10 to 15% of our personnel. I got the end strength numbers of aircraft maintenance personnel to show there was this severe decrease in personnel and then experience that goes along with it. I got flying hours to show that we did not let up on our operational tempo. So I had this spreadsheet that I built that had all of this information where I could show our fleet was anemic from 2010 to 2014. We cut 15,000 people out of the Air Force. I can show which career fields lost them, and we sustained the exact same operational tempo, and then suicide spiked up broadly across the Air Force, right? So I'm doing the interview with Senator King, and we're kind of talking about my time in aircraft maintenance. And he says, hey, Chris, let's pretend you're testifying in the Senate Armed Services Committee. Why is it in the civilian sector, aircraft can maintain like a 98% readiness rate, but here in the military, we're struggling to even make 70%? And I was ready. I didn't know that question was going to be asked. I didn't know I was going to have this opportunity, but I answered that question because I already knew the answer. And it wasn't me just in my experience. It was, we lost this, we lost it here. This is our operational tempo. So obviously that was probably not a question he was expecting to be answered in that way. But at the end of the interview, when the recording went off, I said, hey, can I get 2 minutes of your time? I really need your help. I'm trying to get suicide data by occupational code in the Air Force. They've stonewalled me. I really need help. And he said, do you want me to help you get it? I said, actually, I was going to get it and give it to you because you're on the Senate Armed Services Committee and you exercise oversight over the DOD. And this is something you need to know. And nobody knows this. It's not public. And he said, that's a good point. So then I had a meeting with his staffers like a month later, and we were brainstorming about what to do. And eventually they settled on, well, it can't just be Air Force, Chris, got to be all, oh, absolutely all services. And they said, how far back do you want to go? I said, well, I wanted to go back to 2010. And then one of them's like, well, why don't we go all the way back to 9/11? That encapsulates the entire war. I'm like, that's a great idea. There's no reason why we shouldn't get more information out there. And so they said, okay, great. And so I emailed them maybe 2 weeks later, said, and I had some friends like on the House Armed Services Committee staffers through my military network. I said, hey, is there anything I can do on the House side to smooth this over? I'd love to help. I just want to make sure this happens. And then they responded, do you want to take a crack at drafting it, Chris? So I was in my third year of law school, it was like in April. So I was getting ready for finals, and I abandoned all studying, and I Googled how to draft federal legislation, and I found some study of parts reliability for an F-35. So at least I had the structure, and then I started drafting it. And I went back and looked at what I had submitted, my draft. It was not very good. My admin law professor would not be proud of me. And what actually ended up going into the law was really quite good. It was very specific. I wrote it kind of mushy. They wrote very specific. The Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security will submit a report that disaggregates suicide rates by year, occupational code, and in parentheses, Air Force Specialty Code, Army MOS, Marine MOS, Navy rate, Coast Guard rate. So it was the granular by service occupational codes by year, by rank, and by component, active duty, guard, or reserve. And so I got a call from Senator King in June of 2022. He said, Chris, I want to read you something. And he was reading the legislation that was in the Senate draft. And that was big. That saved me a lawsuit. It saved me years of just hurling my body at this bureaucratic wall. And it was like this release of finally. And it said, an interim report is due by June 30th of 2023, and the final report is due by December 31st of 2023. And I was like, that's it. Like, now we're just waiting. I actually joined a Department of Defense working group to create a model of post-vention suicide analysis for organizational culture in my free time. And the December 31st date came and went. January 3rd, after the weekend was over, I started calling up, where's the report? And it was like, we don't know. And 7 months later, the report finally came out, and it was not disaggregated by year. It was not disaggregated by occupation code. And they didn't go back to 2001. They didn't disaggregate by rank. And it wasn't like they just didn't do it. They said, we're not going to disaggregate by year because of a DOD instruction. Now, a DOD instruction is not going to supersede the National Defense Authorization Act explicit law, right? So when I got that, I mean, I'm at I'm at 5 years of advocacy on this particular subject. I'm at 6 years of advocacy for the service, for the blog, but I've been chasing this FOIA from July of 2019, and now it's July 30th of 2024. 5 years, thousands of hours. I can't calculate how many hours I poured into this, right? And to get that report where it's just mushed up data where they said, we're not going to do what you said. That was a rough day. That was a real rough day. My dog got worried about me, right? Like she's like, I've never seen you like this before. And the powerlessness I felt, because it's like, we wrote a law and the law said to do this and they just didn't. Like, I will never have that much. I have to be president to have more power than that law was exerting. And I got bad news for you, Nate. Chris McGhee is not going to be president, right? Like, it's not in the cards for Chris McGhee. So the hopelessness, like I had been waiting, 18 months, 20, actually, no, 2 years because it was late. I'd been waiting 2 years for that report, and for it to be like that, it was just crushing. And so I went to the Portland Press Herald and I went to local media to try to implore them to kind of talk about this. The Portland Press Herald did do a front page article as of a recording like 2 weeks ago. And then 6 days ago, Senator Angus King sent a letter to the Secretary of Defense saying the report was not legally sufficient. You need to redo it. So there's still a lifeline going. And so I still have some hope, but the fight is not over.
It certainly isn't. It's an illustrious story, first of all. And I just have to say, obviously, there of course is a bright side here, that there is a lifeline. So it's not quite done with. I don't think it will ever, hopefully it will be done with soon enough. But it just goes to show the systemic sort of things that go on, maybe the inefficiencies, the not list. I mean, that's crazy that you pass a law and they still didn't do it. Like that's mind-blowing. And
Correct.
it is disappointing at the same time that there are systems like that where it's just completely inefficient, that it doesn't work the way it's supposed to go. And especially for yourself with your background in troubleshooting, doing, F-16 jets were extremely complex. This isn't something that's a complex issue. This is simply just data being put in a certain way that someone could probably do in a spreadsheet in 5 seconds.
Correct.
So it's mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing. I really can't believe, but something that you talked about in the article, not to get dark here, I'm not getting dark here, but I'd just like get into the meat potatoes of the issue here. Now, you spoke a lot about the abuse within the organization, that there is a lot of that stuff going on. So can you talk a little bit about that stuff? Because I want to get your message out there. I want to make sure people are hearing these things, because I'm now motivated. I'm activated to see what happens with this sort of stuff.
Yeah. So, it's a Nate, would you ever go see a doctor if you knew you couldn't sue them for malpractice?
Probably not. That's not
right. Because even if they're a good doctor, it kind of doesn't matter, because you've set the bar real low, right? They might be well above that bar, but it's a bad feeling, right? And so, as I said, with the Supreme Court case, Ferris versus United States, and the Ferris doctrine that kind of drove from that is a service member cannot sue the military for negligence or intentional torts or anything. And so what you create an environment where there's just very, very low accountability. And so when I was in the military, I thought I was a great leader. And I thought when I retired, I have this great leadership toolkit, and I'm going to go into the civilian sector and I can lead anything, because look, I told you I managed a fleet worth $1.5 billion, right? And I managed that whole production effort. But here's what I found. I can have a very robust leadership toolkit where I can build like relationships with you, with trust and all these things. But if I only have 5 people and I need to do 10 people's jobs, I don't have time to employ my full leadership toolkit. And what I found was being an asshole is a shortcut to productivity. I don't have to get you to trust me or get you to believe in what we're doing or to understand why we're doing it. I can just scream at you and threaten you. And also, by the way, there's the entire undercurrent of the lawful authority of me telling you to do something. If you don't do it, I can put you in jail. You can, like, I don't say it, but we all understand it. I can cause a conviction that'll make it so you don't get, federal student loans. You can't own a firearm in a lot of states. You have to report it on your employment applications. It's all an undercurrent that exists, right? And I can work you 12 hours a day, 7 days a week without limit. And you have no union, no labor relations protections. You can't go to you can technically go to the media, but then you're also going to run afoul of all sorts of those issues. So you create this population where it's going to come as no surprise to anybody. When the more authority you have without accountability, abuse will always derive from that. So when I talked about in the article about there was low emotional intelligence and systemic abuse, I entered an environment where I was treated less than because they could. And then also I grew up in that environment and I became abusive in my leadership as well. So all of my advocacy work, part of it is also to atone for what I did and to make things better. And I'm trying to shine a light on what people are experiencing that I might have actually put some toxic, horrible stuff into that environment as well, right? But I can take responsibility for it, but I can also go, I can fix it. I can help fix it too. And that's how I'm going to make amends here. Because I have a podcast and I have lots of listeners, and I bet there are people that work for me that go, Chris is full of shit. I work for him. He was awful. And you know what? They aren't wrong. Because when I would scream at someone and you probably figured out, like, I have a gift to gab. Like I can talk well. I'm not doing it well when I talk about it, right? But it also works with dressing someone down. I can speak in such a way, I can use certain words, or I can make people feel shame for existing and slice up their soul. And that's awful. And I'm not proud of that, right? But that was an environment that was rewarded, because when I would do that, I would get productivity, and then I would be lauded. Look how good you did getting your people to fix Judge Jet. Look at these numbers coming up. We created a system that incentivizes abuse, rejects accountability, and rejects transparency. So that is, like, it's not physical abuse, but that doesn't matter, because when you destroy someone over and over by giving them an impossible solution and blaming them when they don't solve it, when you don't resource them, when you don't give them enough time, you don't give them enough people, you don't give them the right equipment, and you create a system that requires them to lie and be dishonest, saying that something's good when it's not, and you reward them for it, but if they get caught, they get punished. Like, there's moral injuries all over the place with that. It's not a good thing. So when this suicide report comes out, this is not the end. It is. I'm trying to start. I'm trying to start diagnosing. I'm trying to describe the symptoms. And here's what I'll say, Nate, because one of my FOIA requests, I went to the Air Force because they developed a computer-based training in 2016 called Overwhelmed Aircraft Maintainer Suicide Awareness Training. Now, what I'll tell you, somebody who's been in the military 20 years, they don't develop an entire training course called Overwhelmed Aircraft Maintainer Suicide Awareness Training unless they had a reason to. So I went to the Air Force and said, I want all the data and all the information you use to decide to make this course. And what I got back was raw suicide numbers for some career fields. And what I'll tell you is the 2A3 career field, the career field I was in 2014. So in 2014, the Air Force suicide rate was 14 per 100,000 people. My career field was 45 per 100,000 people. So you're not talking a 10 to 15% difference. You're talking about a 300% difference between the Air Force rate and my career field suicide rate.
Law students, are you feeling overwhelmed, stressed, or short on time in law school? Maybe you just want someone to show you a step-by-step framework to master the topics you're learning in your classes. I know the pressure you're under, and I've got the perfect solution for you. My course, The Law School Operating System, is proven to help you conquer law school with confidence and ease.
Created by Lisa Blasser, a former guest on the podcast and founder of the Law School Success Institute, this course breaks down every subject into manageable main topics that you run through a comprehensive study system to thoroughly prepare you for class and final exams. No more feeling like you need to know everything all at once in the beginning.
But that's not all, Nate. The law school operating system also teaches you how to schedule your studying and time effectively. For every topic, you'll know which study step you're on and when you'll complete it every week of your semester. No more mad dash cram sessions, more time with your loved ones. And with my system, you'll walk into your exams knowing you've given 100% of yourself, that there's nothing more you could have done to succeed, and there's no better confidence than that.
Lisa breaks it down like this: one class, one list of main topics, and one system to master each topic. With recorded and live sessions for students available on her website and partnerships with law schools nationwide, the Law School Operating System is here to help you thrive from day one to the final exam. Ready to take control of your law school journey and operate at your full potential in law school? Visit www.lisablassers.com today and enroll in the Law School Operating System. Be sure to use code LSOSNATE10 at checkout for 10% off the recorded course. That is code LSOSNATE10 at checkout. Now, back to the show. That's not good. It's very much not good. But I just have to say first, I have to express my gratitude for your honesty throughout this entire episode and being so candid about your experiences, because there are things that really happen and there are things that are still really happening to this day. And especially going back to sort of those organizational methods, those organizational behaviors, something you said that is very, very important. I think something that is sticking with me is that in terms of having that bar so low, not being able to sue for anything, is that you're incentivizing people to not sort of act in a certain way that they're
Correct.
supposed to act. And when you incentivize that sort of behavior in a system like that, it will just continue to go and go and go and go, and it will never stop, because it's the only way. After a while, like you said, you don't have enough resources, you don't have enough manpower, so the only possible thing you can do is just be an asshole, which is not great, but it's incentivizing that sort of behavior. So it's sort of that give and take, and you could only do so much, of course, but I think it's just fantastic what you're doing. You're a tenacious advocate, like you said, and you really, really are, and I am excited for what the future has to hold for you and what you're trying to pursue. And of course, for anyone out there, look out for Chris, because he is really out here fighting for these veterans, for the people who defend our country. And that is so ultimately the most important thing we could do, is support our veterans, of course. But Chris, not to switch gears all like that, because this is a real switch gear here, because we're down to our last 5 questions. The first of the 5 questions, something you talked about before, that you got your system, your softwares for your law firm, for the advocacy that you do. So this is sort of the tech stack question per se. But what does your, this is such a crazy change of gears, but what does your tech stack look like, and what recommendations of any products do you have for people?
I'll tell you what. So first of all, I use ChatGPT religiously. I don't use it for legal research. I don't use it for anything like that. But what I do is, I realized that I talked to a friend of mine a few months ago, and he unlocked this for me, and I had no idea. I get writer's block really bad. And writer's block as an attorney, that's not good. Like, that doesn't work well. But what I figured out was, as you've pretty much been able to tell, I'm really good speaking. And that's probably because I spent 20 years in aircraft maintenance, where everything you do is verbal or even visual communication with hand signals. And at the very end of the night, you quickly vomit what you can remember into the aircraft forms, into the computer system. But 99% of my communication was verbal. I need to directly speak to you. I need to explain something. And so I'm very good with the verbal. And so what I do is, and also I was blue collar for 20 years. So I don't have like the email speak down yet, right? So what I do is I go into ChatGPT. Obviously, I leave the client name out of it, but I go, I want to write an email to my client. And I just, and I'm not typing. I click the little microphone thing, and I'm talking to ChatGPT the whole time. And then it regurgitates out like the email. And then I go, okay, I need you to de-emphasize this, overemphasize this. Let's also, and I just play editor at that point. And then they get it, and I scrub it, and I plug the client's name in it, and I send it off. And it makes the time it saves me is astronomical. I genuinely don't think I could run a solo practice efficiently without a large language model doing what a large language model is perfectly designed to do, which is to take Chris McGhee's expertise and assemble all the words around it, so that way it delivers to the client in the best professional package. I have case management software where I have digital signatures and all these things, and I keep track of dates through my case portal and all those sorts of things. I have a Zoom subscription, so when I do consultations with my clients, they can either choose video or they can choose telephone. But really, for me, it's the My Case, case management software, and ChatGPT for the non substantive legal work that I have to do.
I, just like yourself, am a huge fan of ChatGPT. I've actually known about it for almost 5 years now. So when I was a senior in high school, I was big into it, the large language models, because it was new, it was cutting edge. I like shiny things, so I was chasing it around. But as time has went on, I have found so much value out of it, just like you said, in sort of getting that writer's block out, being able to just sort of explore your ideas, being able to edit like that. Because if you get specific with it, it will allow you to be
Yep.
specific, and it will give you the outputs that you want. And that's one of the things I've really been taking advantage of, playing around with the prompts. One of the things that I've learned, which is like, oh, go ahead.
Now, I will caution, because I didn't know this when I first started. I remember reading a case in law school, and it was about a JAG attorney, prosecutor that was making overt career threats to a defense attorney during a case. And I was like, oh, I need to find this case. I remembered what geographic area was in. I remember the rank of the prosecutor. I remember the rank of the defense attorney. I remember a ballpark when it was. And I plugged it into ChatGPT. I said, I'm looking for this case. And it lied to me for 3 hours, made up case names. And I was like, okay, well, link me to articles about it. And then it gave me fake links to articles. Like, it had full hallucinations. So that was for me. And obviously, and this was certainly wasn't for legal work. I was trying to show it to some of my advocate friends, because it's a very disheartening story of prosecutorial misconduct and command influence. But it was a very good lesson for me, luckily in a bit of a sandbox mode, that you can't use large language models for the substantive part of your legal work. You cannot. You can do the legal work and you can inject it in. Hey, I'm reading this case. This is the issue. You can explain it, and then you can go and I brainstorm with ChatGPT, like trying to solve things, but you cannot ask ChatGPT to produce information. You cannot. That you're going to run into trouble.
That I 100% agree with. And as well, something that I've learned, especially over time, is that, you can get your information out of it pretty quickly. The very surface level stuff you can get, but I use it a lot more for inputting a ton of stuff. Maybe either that be organizing. So, I'll have a lot of details, or I'll have a full Google Doc and I'm like, organize this in a way, and it will do it perfectly. And it will take 5 seconds. And that's the great part about it, is just how efficiently it is, just how seamless it is. There is no friction. You just copy and paste and then you're done. So I love that very much. But the one thing that I've learned, if you say at the beginning of your prompts, take a deep breath, it will actually give you a better output than you usually would do. I don't know why. I don't understand it. I just learned it on Google, or I think it was a podcast. Someone was talking about it, and they said, yeah, if you do that and make it better. I do it for every single one of my prompts now, and it actually does give better results. Doesn't make any sense, but it's just how it goes. But Chris, we're now down to our fourth to last question. The fourth question is live on the Lawyers in the Making podcast. Chris, what are your book recommendations for people? It doesn't have to be about the law, just some of your favorite books you've ever read, something to give a gift to someone.
Man, I don't have one. So here's what I'll say. I'll give one. So I'll give two. So law school really broke me for reading. And that's everybody says that. I can read websites and I can read cases and things, but actually sitting down with a book and turning pages, to me, is a very arduous sort of process now. And so what I did find, especially in law school, when I was trying to write like one of my bigger papers, where I was trying to get something published, and it was like a very heavy lift of legal writing, I actually began reading a book by Sean Carroll called Something Deeply Hidden, and it's about quantum mechanics and the many worlds theory. And I'm not good at math, but I'm not dumb. And so luckily his book is kind of translating into how waveforms happen and possibilities and all these things. And what I found was it was very stimulating with a totally different part of my brain that was not exhausted. And so it was a great way for me to continue essentially my intellectual pursuit without taxing the same parts of my brains that I was using for my legal writing or legal research. And I thought that was quite good. And then the second thing is the books by James S.A. Corey, the Expanse series. I I watched The Expanse on Amazon, and I started reading the books recently. They are very faithful to the show, or the show is very faithful to the books, but it is one of the best stories ever, and it is very closely resembles what it was like in aircraft maintenance as far as the culture and all these things. So it's quite good and quite accurate.
Well, I always love two new books. Never had any of those recommended, both of those recommended on the podcast. So I always love that. I actually do know Sean Carroll. I've listened to him. I believe he's on the Lex Friedman podcast. I can't be certain, but I listen to him because, quantum mechanics, it is very abstract, but they're talking about things that are like super cool, super
Yep.
abstract, and things you would have never imagined exist. So it's kind of like magic, and I love magic.
Yep.
So why not? But the last question here, Chris, what are the sorts of things you consume, not food, consume on a daily basis, either that be through social media, so Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube, Reddit, any podcasts you listen to that you recommend, any Substacks or any articles, newsletters that you recommend? What is passing the transom of Chris's mind on a daily basis?
So yeah, I'll be honest with this one too. I mean, I've been honest all the time. But Facebook is kind of dead to me. Twitter, I don't use anymore. That's kind of gone into a bit of a trash heap as well. LinkedIn, I use LinkedIn a lot now. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I don't use it for social media. I do use it for professional networking. That's where I met. That's actually where I saw, I think his last name is Spivey, first name.
Mike Spivey.
Yeah, Mike Spivey, where he's actually, no, it was someone else said you were one of the podcasts they listened to. I think it was a law dean somewhere. And that's when I listened to you when I was driving somewhere, and I was like, oh, I bet Nate would want to talk to Chris McGhee. And so that's also obviously where we connected, but also almost all my advocacy work I'm doing there, because also, again, as I've told some elected officials in the last 3 months, I'm willing to burn everything to the ground because I'm not a politician. I don't have to worry about these relationships. I'm an advocate, and the more tenacious I am, the more painful I become for elected officials. I'm actually no one's going to be like, boy, I don't want an attorney that fights that hard. Right? So like all the things that I do, all my advocacy work is creating all these touch points in the veteran community, in the service member community. They can see that I'm genuine, that I'm not just chasing money and things like this, that I am pouring thousands of unpaid hours into this advocacy work. So they know that I'm a genuine attorney, and that all comes through on LinkedIn. And I'll tell you what, my commander in 2006, who's now a very good friend of mine, Kevin Traw, he's been on the podcast multiple times. Basically, we stopped cussing nearly as much on my podcast, so that way we could start posting them on LinkedIn, so it wasn't me dropping F-bombs and things. And that was also an inflection point, because now I've turned my podcast advocacy and that amplification into also a platform on my LinkedIn that was just going to create all of this noise in this space that I'm working on. So that was really important. And it really just required me to raise the bar in my podcast, so that way Kevin Traw would feel comfortable sharing it with his network of 5,000 people or whatever it is, right? So that's big. I do peruse Reddit. I go on the subreddit for Air Force because obviously that's near and dear to my heart. I actually found Reddit to be one of my best client streams because I'll post my advocacy work and I'll mention I'm a VA disability attorney, and then my case leads profile that feeds in from my website, I'll get 4 or 5 lead client requests just from posting on Reddit. I mean, that's not why I go there. I'm really I go there because I want to let people know, and this is probably the overarching point for my advocacy work, is suicide is because there's people that are suffering and they feel it's not going to end. They think that's never going to end. Whatever their suffering is, whatever their position is going to be in. And by me trying to shine a light on their experience and their suffering, I'm trying to give them a voice so they have hope that it will get better. So when I post on Reddit, it's because I'm trying to let them know that there's been setbacks. The report was mush. I'm sorry, but here's the Portland Press Herald that did a piece on it and why it's terrible. And here's the letter that Senator King signed and sent to SecDef. So now your boss's boss has to answer for why his data is mush. hold on. I don't say hold on, but I want them to hold on because I want people to read that and hope. I want them to know that there's someone out there that's fighting for them. And so I go on Reddit just to let them know, but I don't post if it's not advocacy work. I kind of lurk. And then I also follow the war in Ukraine on Reddit as well. I lurk on that because I don't want to, be involved in it, but I want to keep tabs on it because I think it's one of the bigger issues of our lifetime, I believe.
Well, I love it because I say Reddit every time. And it's been like almost, I don't know, 87, 88 episodes. And I've never had anyone talk about Reddit. So I finally got someone talking about Reddit and how they use it because I like to peruse on Reddit a little bit. I lurk a little bit. I get into my things. So I think it's a great app. It's great for a very, very niche information
Yep.
lay there. Because you go on the other apps, it's very surface level, but you get really niche stuff in there. So I like that. I like a lot of my wrestling. I love professional wrestling. So I peruse on there about my professional wrestling. Got to keep up with everything. Who's
Yep.
signing where. It's very important to me. But second to last question here, talking about your advocacy, you're working, you got the podcast, you got your firm, but what does an ideal Friday night and Sunday morning look for Chris?
So every Sunday morning I do brunch with my youngest daughter. My oldest daughter's in college. My youngest daughter is still at home. Every Sunday morning I do brunch with her because it's less about where we go, but more about we're setting aside 30 minutes to an hour. And we sit down and I go, all right, what dad wisdom do you want? Like, what do you want to talk about? And it's a very organic sort of conversation. We'll talk about anything and everything. And I'm really trying to help her think independently and kind of view things from different angles and be as objective as possible and understand other people's perspectives. So an ideal Sunday morning to me, and obviously it's Maine, so spring to fall is gorgeous, winter not so much. So sometimes it's just walking across the street to the coffee shop, getting some hot cocoa and coming home. But that's a good Sunday. A Friday night, I think it's just I used to do it when I was in law school, and I used to do it when I worked for someone else. I would, have a good dinner, and then after dinner, I would like drink a beer or two and kind of just put my feet up and unwind. I don't feel the need to do that anymore. So my Friday nights are maybe a movie night with my daughter. Maybe it's a very good conversation with my partner. My partner is a brilliant woman, and I adore her. And my podcast exists because she is here. My podcast started as a video on my Facebook page for my blog, and she didn't have Facebook, and she's like, "Oh, it's really hard for me to watch this." This was a bit before we started, like when we first started talking. I said, "Oh, I'll just throw it up on an RSS feed and make a podcast for you to listen to." So I literally made my podcast so my partner would have an easier time listening to me pontificate about organizational culture. And so my 50,000 downloads now and all of the work that I've done, she would have obviously not taken any credit for it, but she was the first step in creating the platform that ultimately led to a lot of this stuff. But she's brilliant. So I consider conversations with her to be always in the best faith and very substantial, and she's so inquisitive that I'm always impressed with her. And like I said, she's brilliant. So that probably counts as well.
Well, that's amazing that your partner was indeed your first ever listener as well. So that is such a milestone in itself that you got your first listener, but it's also your significant other. How amazing, how much better could it possibly be? But last question here, Chris. I do this at the end of every single episode. Every single guest gets this question. But what are your words of wisdom for the aspiring law students, the current law students, and the legal professionals, and pretty much anyone else out there? Because you are just full of so much wisdom. Anyone can learn from this.
I'm not going to tell them not to take it seriously, because I think if you're 21 years old, graduating from law school, or maybe 22, 23, depending on the age, with $350,000 in student loan debt, you do need to take it seriously. What I would simply say is you can work hard and take it seriously because that's what you want to do. But don't let your grades or your class rank define you as a person. And what I'll say is that is so much easier said than done. And I say that as someone that was 40-year-old in law school, had a 20-year military career, a full pension, a mortgage, like all of this lived experience. And I still felt the pull of valuation from my grades and shame if I got like a bad score. So it's not easy. It just requires you to reframe it. It's when you get trapped in like a feedback loop of grades and things that you get that mental health degradation. What I'll also say is my boss now, he actually doesn't care what my grades are or were. He thinks I'm a great worker. He thinks I'm handsome, funny, charismatic. He thinks all these things. No, but like the real point is like it might feel like the grades are the most important thing in the moment, but probably 10 years after law school, it's not going to be, is what I'll say. So go in knowing that it's going to be hard, and go in knowing that it's going to be an ego shot, and just get through it. Because law school is meant to be gotten through. Like once you're in law school, you actually have to try to get kicked out of law school. You just do, and then you're going to graduate, and then you have something. You have something powerful. And I'll say my JD has very likely given me a lot more force when I start talking to people. When I say Chris McGhee, attorney at law, that's way different than Chris McGhee, F-16 crew chief. It's totally different. And so like getting that degree and earning it, it opens doors for you. And that's like the thing that matters the most to me, is not squandering this gift, this power. Like you are an advocate. No one can deny that I'm an advocate, and I am tenacious. It began with the Air Force saying that data doesn't exist. And I have not let go. And now they have the Secretary of Defense answering to Congress because they just didn't want to give Chris McGhee the data in 2020. I bet in hindsight, they wish they would have given it to me, because I would have been in a pandemic on a podcast with 20 listeners at the time, just screaming about how bad these numbers are. Now there's like congressional inquiries and things. So use your power.
Both, Chris, it's beautifully said. It's a beautiful sentiment. Just got to keep pushing on. It's only a grade. It's only a number. You just got to keep that long-term vision, hold on for dear life, and continue to work towards the goals you want to get. But Chris, that is the podcast. That is the episode. So thank you so much for coming on here. Oh, wait, he's got one more thing to say. Say it.
Yeah, so I just want to run through like where you can find me. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Chris McGhee, and then also the 20yearsdone.com. If you want to find my law firm, it's www.fafo-law.com, fafo-law.com. And also the 20 Years Done podcast. You can find me on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all those sort of podcast things as well.
And for all you beautiful people listening, it will all be in the description below. So you got easy access. You know exactly where it is because I just told you. But like I said, be sure to check us out, lawyersinthemaking.substack.com. That's lawyers in the making, one word, substack.com. And I will see you all in the next one.